This week, Stephen is out sick. Melissa and I try our best to define discipleship, and we are prompted with a question from another podcast, Priest Pulse. It's episode 35, Define Discipleship.
Game on.
Well, hey, everybody. We are back again with a Sustainable Ministry Show. Today, hanging out with Melissa Rao. Unfortunately, Stephen Ingram is sick and couldn't make the recording with us today. But we are hanging out. We're going to do this thing anyways. Right, Melissa?
Yeah, man. I hope you feel better, Stephen.
Yes, we miss you. Those of you who are out there, his email address is stephen@ministryarchitects.com. It's PHEN. Feel free to give him a shout. Let him know that you're thinking about him and you wish he was feeling better. That would be awesome if we could just inundate him with some feel better emails. So one of the things we've been doing, Melissa, we've been collecting questions from folks, and the guys over at Priest Pulse, another podcast I have been listening to now. I think you're familiar with who they are. I'm quickly becoming big fans of them. But they posed a question on Twitter to us after one of our previous episodes where we talked about attendees and service and worship and all that sort of stuff. And they said to us, I'd like to hear more about making disciples servants versus making attendees at planned events. What do you think about that? It's a big question, and sometimes churches are just about attendance. But there's a transition, right?
Yeah, when I saw that on the Twitter, I thought, oh, that's my good friend, the Reverend Ben Wallace. And I was really excited to know that not only is he listening to us, but that he's actually engaging with what we're talking about. I think it is. It's a loaded question. I think the podcast that he was referring to was when we were kind of talking about attendance. And I think we were talking about marketing or communicating. Mm-hmm. Right? Correct me if I'm wrong. And so I really pondered that question. I thought it was so insightful and a really good one. What are we doing as a church? What is the whole purpose behind having events in the first place? Many times I think we're getting together for fellowship. And I think fellowship is a key component of discipleship. But sometimes I think we lose focus and we're just doing events just to have events.
Yeah, and this is not a blanket statement. I don't mean it that way, but I think even like with mission events, sometimes we plan those for our church to feel good about themselves, and we do those things to feel good about themselves. And I don't think there's any church who intends that necessarily. I think we intend for discipleship, but maybe we've lost sight of what the goal of this event is, and so we may call it an outreach, but it's full of folks in our worshiping body, and it's really a fellowship event, or we plan a mission event because we know that we need to be doing something, not necessarily because there are people who need to be served, and there are people who need to be served, but we've often lost sight of maybe the purpose behind those, and so then it does become solely about like, okay, how many people showed up? How many people from our church were a part of this thing? And I don't think, we've talked before, I don't think you can get away from numbers. We need to measure numbers. That's an important part of what we do. But I also think that we need to kind of recenter on what the purpose of those events and programs are.
Yeah. Well, I think it would be good too, is just kind of define disciple. I feel like that's become one of those loaded buzzwords. And do you know what I mean? I think disciple is different for some than others. And so I think it might be helpful for us to kind of define about where we're coming from, how we're approaching that word. So I'd be interested, Bryant, if you have thoughts, but I did a very brief exercise about, define disciple, just so we can kind of come to an understanding. And this is a very, very basic Merriam-Webster dictionary definition. And the first one is one who accepts and assists in spreading the doctrines of another. That also talks about one of the inner circle of Christ's followers according to the gospel accounts. And is convinced adherent of a school or individual thought. So that's kind of what the good Merriam-Webster dictionary
You gotta love
has said.
Merriam-Webster.
I know, right? I just feel like we need to have a starting point there. So, I believe that discipleship is kind of a three-step approach. I feel like it's about teaching, it's about learning, but then it's also about holding the hand of another and helping to teach and learn as we're going through our journey together.
Yeah. So another caveat, right? I think regardless of how we define it, we're going to fall short,
For sure.
right? And so that part is kind of loaded and hard to start with. But I would define discipleship as especially for us in the church, it's the process of becoming more like Jesus. And sometimes discipleship is talked about as the goal or the result or the place we've landed. And that's where maybe we miss the mark to be able to say, okay, now you're a disciple. I think maybe we're all disciples, but we're in the process of becoming better disciples. And so discipleship really is about the process where then our events, the things we're inviting people to, the things we're going out to reach out to folks about, and the places that we're heading out to serve are really about that process. And we have the glorious opportunity to be engaged in the discipleship process, not just with ourselves, but with other people as well. And so it may help really to step back and say, okay, what's this event for? Why are we doing it? Where in the process of discipleship does it fit?
I think that's perfect. I love that you said that some folks are about the end game. But even the apostles, in Jesus' time, they were disciples before he, died and rose again and, ascended. And I felt like they messed up a lot along the way. And so I feel like Jesus kind of taught us and modeled for us the way that we can be there for our brothers and sisters and whatnot. So at least we have a commonality. We have a common understanding of what we think we're going for when we talk about discipleship. I'm going to share with you a very interesting story just in my own personal context. My husband is also an Episcopal priest. So that's how we know the good Reverend Ben. My husband and Ben went to seminary together. And so Ben is in a parish outside of Philadelphia, as so is my husband. So, this past weekend, we celebrated Blessing of the Pets, St. Francis of Assisi. And our church did something we had never done before. And in addition to a Blessing of the Pet ceremony that we had, inviting a whole bunch of pets and even stuffed animals and pictures were welcome. We packed the church with more folks than we've ever had, but we also had a pet fair following it from 2 to 5. It was awesome. We even had a canine handler from the local police force. It was so awesome. She did a demonstration with the dog, and it was a really cool time. The week prior, though, I was making an announcement in the service, and I didn't say anything during the service because, you never ever want to make the announcements longer than they have to be.
That's right.
So I didn't say anything, but we have this, tradition where everybody just pours into the parish hall to enjoy coffee hour with one another. And it was about 10 to 15 minutes through the coffee hour where I actually kind of rang the bell. And I totally know it was probably above and beyond me to do this, but I did it anyway. Unfortunately, my husband didn't yell at me. But I stood up and I said, I just needed to share with you all that we are going to be doing this pet fair next weekend. And we've never done something like this. And our Facebook, the ad or the Facebook, I don't know if it was an advertisement, but it reached over 3,000 people.
Oh, wow.
And right. And so we're like, we have no clue what to expect here. But a lot of good stuff is happening and attendance is up and people are getting excited about that, right? We know, so I would say Holy Nativity is paying its rents in the numbers area. People are excited about people coming and participating. And I just said, friends, I know we're having this event, but we can't forget why we're having this event. This just to feel good about ourselves to say, wow, there wasn't a single pew left for people to sit in between pets and dogs, and that so many people came to this first pet fair that we've had. This is an opportunity for us to celebrate the feast of St. Francis, to come together to have our own pets blessed, but be inviting, and just being present and welcoming to other people, just about the number. It's not just about doing this event to feel good. And so I said, we have to remember the reason why we're doing this in the first place, and it's Jesus. So like,
Yeah.
he is the reason, and we're not doing this just to feel good about ourselves. And so I felt the need to say that out loud. And it was so silly. People clapped for me, and I'm like, no, you don't have to clap for me. And that's not what I was saying, but I just felt so moved to say, let's not forget why we're doing this in the first place.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, Priest Pulse and Ben, if that kind of answers your question a little bit. I feel like we have to keep it real. We can't forget that every single thing that we're doing needs to tie into our vision and the mission of who we are, and that we're doing it as an extension and a reflection of our values. And as long as we can say that that is true, and that we every now and then remind ourselves of the reason why, I believe that discipleship will be at the core of that, rather than just attendance for attendance sake.
I think so too, and that's a really good example of when we talk about the purpose of an event or a program or opportunity or whatever you call it within the life of your church, to be able to point people back to the direction of like, this is why we're doing this thing, and to help keep them on board then with what you think the outcomes of that are, whatever they are, right? Like, maybe it is fellowship, maybe that is the outcome that let's name it. As we go
Yeah.
into that thing, and let's invite our congregations into that so we don't miss those opportunities, to be about the thing that we're about, which I think in all those forms is Christ, right? And behind the doors, leadership of the church often talks about these things, and sometimes the breakdown is between pastors and church staff discussing discipleship and what they hope to accomplish through that, and then moving that forward into the congregation so that the congregation is also understanding of like, okay, so when I come to this event, we're hoping that others will be introduced to Christ, or their faith will be deepened in Christ, or will be serving others because of how Christ has served us. But I think we got to name it, and some of the breakdown happens in not to just keep directing people back to systems, but I think the breakdown happens because some of our systems aren't in place. It's a difficult thing, I think, to talk about too, because when we talk about discipleship, God is going to do God's thing regardless of what we do. and, and and God is moving. God is changing lives. God is opening other people up to maybe a new experience of what love looks like, that they haven't had before. And God is going to do that regardless.
God is going to move in us and through us. But there's a level of community that needs to be understood. I don't think discipleship can be done individually,
Right.
or effective discipleship, right? So I feel like when we're talking about events or any programming, I feel like our members sometimes can be reminded, I need to be reminded at times, that
Yep.
this is not a solo journey. And so when we start talking about numbers, sometimes I feel like we can get bogged down to that because we're making it about individuals. And so I feel like we just have to be mindful that we're not going to whittle things down to the actual person, that discipleship is a group effort. And there is something to be said about that. So I think that was a little nebulous. It wasn't very clear. I'm not sure I'm articulating what I fully mean through that. I'm not sure how to put that into words, but we can't become so focused on the individual and that individual number that we forget that discipleship it's a group thing.
Yeah, we're not in this alone. That's what I would take from what you said. We're not in this alone as church leaders, as members, as like a first time visitor, as pastors. You're not in this alone. My own growth in my life I don't think there's a single moment where I have grown in my faith that I could mark and say that was because of how I engage Scripture. Um, every
Mm,
single time, it's because of how other people have interacted with me because of what Christ had done in their lives.
I
Um,
think it's a great point.
so I'm fully on board. Like, we can't do discipleship alone. Um, there are things we need to do alone. We need to pray. We need to be reading our Bibles. We need to be in Scripture. Discipleship doesn't happen solely by ourselves.
Right. So when you're talking about attendance, that's totally spot on. So when you're talking about attendance, we want to make sure that any event we do have, we're being mindful of each and every person's personal journey, where they're at, what path they might be on, where they are in that path, and what we can do to help further that along. So it's just coming for the first time and might be a seeker, or if someone is much, much further down, how can we put those people together? I don't know. Maybe there's a question. How can we get the well-formed person together with the seeker person and pair them up and help them further down the journey? So it's not just about attendance. And I feel like Priest Post pointed out, how can we shift the focus,
Yeah.
from just attendance to disciple? And I feel like that's one of the ways, what are we doing as a church? How are we engaging those people? How are we pairing them up? How are we helping people along the journey? If we can approach providing and doing those events together with that in mind, I think we'd be better off.
Yeah, and that's where we as leaders in the church and church staff, I think, need to be held accountable, to remind people of the purpose, to remind people of whatever the process is. I think we're accountable to make sure that those things are in place, and
Yeah,
that is not because of attendance, right? That's because of
yeah,
discipleship. That's what we're in this
for
for.
sure. So
Melissa, go ahead.
I just want to say I'm grateful for your tweets. Keep them coming. Ben, Priest Post, just grateful for you, and I'm glad that we got to have this conversation because it was helping me along my own journey, from the conversation that we had. And when you tweeted that, it was just like kind of like, yes, of course. And I can't lie, your tweet very may well have been the reason why I felt uh, motivated to kind of give that little mini speech in our coffee hour in the first place. So I'm just grateful for the poke.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, because the very thing we're suggesting might have been the very thing we left out.
Yeah, for sure.
So thanks for holding us accountable to that, Priest Pulse. Maybe at some point we can have Ben on the show with us. We would love to do that.
Yeah.
So Melissa, what's going on in your world? Where can people keep up with you?
Wow. Well, I'm on the Twitter. You can follow me at Melissa Rao. Pretty straightforward. And I'm also on Facebook. And yeah, I'm around. I'm going to be going traveling the country, doing lots of assessments and speaking over the course of November and December. So it's going to be a busy month and a half for me. But I'm never too busy for an email or a tweet. So happy to look up. Happy for you to be in touch.
Fantastic. And you guys can certainly find me by email, Bryant at ministryarchitects.com, or on Facebook / Bryant Johnson. I'll be speaking at the Presbytery in Raleigh coming up in just a couple weeks. It's in November. So if any of our listeners are there, I'll give you more details. That is an open event. You are more than welcome to come and participate, regardless of whether or not you're Presbyterian or from another denomination. But as that information is coming out, I'll make sure to share that in a couple of weeks. Melissa, again, thank you so much. It's been a joy, as always, to talk about discipleship. Priest Pulse, thanks for prompting us to take that conversation one step deeper.